So, if a tree falls in a forest and there's nobody there to hear it, does it make a sound? Age-old philosophical question, you might think. But in fact, this was given a decisive answer in the 17th century by the father of modern science, Galileo. And this is really where my book starts. So, a key moment in the scientific revolution was Galileo's declaration that mathematics is to be the language of the new science. So the new science was to have a purely quantitative vocabulary. So this is a much discussed moment. What is less discussed is the philosophical work Galileo had to do to get to this point. And that's because before Galileo, following Aristotle, people thought the physical world was filled with qualities. So there were colours on the surfaces of objects, smells floating through the air, tastes actually inside food. And this was a problem because you can't capture these kind of qualities in a purely quantitative vocabulary like mathematics. So this was a challenge for Galileo's aspiration to exhaustively describe the world in mathematics. So what he did to get around this problem was he proposed a radically new philosophical theory of reality. So we think of Galileo as a great scientist, which he was, but he was also a great philosopher. And he advocated this new philosophical theory of the world. So according to this theory, the qualities aren't really out there in the physical world, rather they're in the consciousness of the observer. So I brought a prop here, tomato. So for Galileo, the redness isn't really on the surface of the tomato, it's rather in the consciousness of the person observing it. That's all I need that for. Or if the spiciness of the paprika isn't really inside the paprika, it's in the consciousness of the person eating it. Or to return to our example, if you have a tree crashing down in a forest, the crashing sound isn't really in the forest, rather it's in the consciousness of the person listening. So no observer, no consciousness, no sound. So Galileo, as it were, stripped the physical world of its qualities. And after he'd done that, all that remained were the purely quantitative features of matter: size, shape, location, motion, properties that can be captured in mathematical geometry. So in Galileo's worldview, there is this radical division between two domains: the quantitative domain of science, this is the physical world with its purely quantitative mathematical properties of size and shape and location and motion, and the qualitative domain of consciousness with its qualities of colours, sounds, smells and tastes. So this was the start of mathematical physics, which has gone very well. But I think what we've forgotten is that it was only ever intended as a partial description of reality, right? The whole project was premised on putting consciousness outside of the domain of science so that you could capture everything else in mathematics. Okay, so why is this important? So I think this has profound implications for the area I work in, namely the science of consciousness. It's now broadly agreed that consciousness poses a very profound challenge to contemporary science, despite our great progress on understanding the brain. We still don't have even the beginnings of an explanation of how complicated electrochemical signaling is somehow able to produce the subjective inner world of colours and sounds and smells and tastes that each of us knows in our own experience. So although this problem is now taken very seriously, one very common reaction is to say, well, okay, there's a real problem here, but we just need to plug away with our standard methods for investigating the brain, and we'll one day crack the mystery of consciousness. And I think the reason people think this is because they think, look at the great success of physical science in explaining more and more of our universe, the incredible technology it's produced. This ought to give us confidence that it'll one day crack the problem of consciousness. But I think this approach, for the reasons I've been saying, is rooted in a sort of misunderstanding of the history of science. Yes, physical science has been incredibly successful, but it's been successful precisely because it was designed to exclude consciousness. So I think if Galileo were to time travel to the present day and hear about this problem of explaining consciousness in the terms of physical science, he'd say, of course you can't do that. I designed physical science to deal with the quantitative, not the qualitative. And the fact that physical science has done incredibly well dealing with the qualitative properties of matter doesn't give us any grounds for thinking it's going to be good at explaining the qualitative reality of consciousness. So that's not to say, having said that, it would be wrong to think, obviously, that physical science has nothing to contribute to the science of consciousness. Physical science, in particular neuroscience, the science of the brain, is absolutely crucial to the science of consciousness. But I think we need to realize what neuroscience can offer us and what it can't. I think essentially what neuroscience gives us are correlations between brain activity and conscious feelings or experiences. So you can scan someone's brain and you can ask them how they're feeling, what they're experiencing, and you can correlate. So you can discover that a certain kind of activity in the hypothalamus, part of the brain associated with appetite, always goes along with a feeling of hunger, right? So you can see that these things always go together. And neuroscience has developed a really rich body of data, these correlations. And that's absolutely, crucial data. But that in itself is not a theory of consciousness. What we ultimately want from a theory of consciousness is an explanation of those correlations. Why is it when you have such and such activity in the hypothalamus, you have a feeling of hunger? Why do these things always go together? And I believe that so long as we're in the Galilean worldview, we can't answer that question. Because at the end of the day, there's no getting around the fact that consciousness is a qualitative, quality-involving phenomenon. If you just think about the redness of a red experience, the smell of coffee, the taste of mint, these experiences are essentially defined by these qualities that they involve. And these kind of qualities, by definition, can't be incorporated in a purely quantitative description of the world. And so as long as we're wedded to Galileo's purely quantitative theory of the physical world, we're never going to be able to bring together the qualitative and the quantitative in a single, unified theory of reality. Okay, that's the problem. Let's turn to the solution. So I think there is a way forward here, and it's rooted in very important work from the 1920s by the philosopher Bertrand Russell and the scientist Arthur Eddington, who was incidentally the first scientist to experimentally confirm Einstein's general theory of relativity after the First World War. So I'm inclined to think these guys did in the 1920s for the science of consciousness what Darwin did in the 19th century for the science of life. And it's a tragedy of history that it was forgotten about for so long. But it's recently been rediscovered, and it's causing a lot of excitement in academic philosophy. And part of the reason I wrote this book is to try and get these ideas that are causing a lot of interest in academic philosophy out to a broader audience. So the starting point of Russell and Eddington is that physical science doesn't really tell us what matter is. So that seems like a kind of bizarre claim at first. If you read a physics textbook, you seem to discover all these incredible things about the nature of space and time and matter. But what Russell and Eddington realized is that for all its richness, physics is confined to telling us about the behavior of matter, what it does. So physics tells us, for example, that matter has mass and charge, and these properties are defined completely in terms of behavior. things like attraction, repulsion, resistance to acceleration. This is all about behavior. Physics tells us nothing about what philosophers like to call the intrinsic nature of matter, what matter is in and of itself, independently of its behavior. So it turns out there's actually this huge hole in our scientific story of the universe. Physical science gives us this incredible information about the behavior of matter, but it leaves us completely in the dark about its intrinsic nature, what it really is in itself. This is sometimes called the problem of intrinsic natures. Okay, so what's this got to do with consciousness? So I think the genius of Russell and Eddington was to bring together two problems that on the face of it have nothing to do with each other, and to see that they can be given a unified solution. So on the one hand, the problem of consciousness, and on the other, the problem of intrinsic natures. So the problem of consciousness is roughly that, we need a place for consciousness in our scientific worldview. We know it exists, but it doesn't seem to fit in. The problem of intrinsic natures is that we've got this huge hole in our scientific worldview. So the solution is put consciousness in the hole, right? We're looking for a place for consciousness. We've got a hole. Let's try and put consciousness in the hole. That's the idea. So the result is a kind of panpsychism. So this, as Robin said, is the ancient view that consciousness pervades the universe and is a fundamental feature of it. But this new wave of panpsychism is panpsychism stripped of its mystical or spiritual connotations that might have accompanied earlier forms of the view. So the view is that there's just matter, right? Nothing spiritual, nothing supernatural, just particles and fields. But matter can be described from two perspectives. Physical science describes it, as it were, from the outside, in terms of its behavior, tells us what it does. But matter from the inside, that is to say, matter in terms of its intrinsic nature, is constituted of forms of consciousness. So this is a beautifully simple, elegant way of integrating consciousness into our scientific worldview. So I like to think of it, in the 1620s, Galileo separated out the qualitative and the quantitative. In the 1920s, Russell and Eddington found a way of bringing them back together. Okay, so just bring things together. Nice picture of my book. So physical science has been incredibly successful in the last 400 years and produced incredible technology that's transformed our planet. But I think what we need to realize is that it's been incredibly successful precisely because it was designed to exclude consciousness. So now pessimists might infer from what I've been saying that we will never have a science of consciousness, that consciousness will always be something magical and mysterious. But that's not my approach. So I think we can have confidence that we will one day have a science of consciousness, but I think we need to rethink what science is. The science of Galileo was not designed to deal with consciousness. If we now want a science of consciousness, I think we need to move to what I sometimes call a post-Galilean paradigm. We need to move to a more expansive conception of the scientific method, one able to accommodate both the quantitative features of matter that physical science has been dealing so well with for the past 400 years, and the qualitative reality of consciousness that each of us knows from our immediate awareness of our feelings and experiences. And I think this Russell-Eddington panpsychism gives us a way of doing this. So what I'm essentially calling for is a new scientific revolution. And as I describe in the book, in fact, this is something that's already happening as scientists and philosophers are coming together to lay the foundations for a new science of consciousness, a new approach to consciousness. And finally, I want to say, I think this matters. Consciousness is at the root of human identity. It's arguably the basis of everything that's important in human existence. And so I think this new scientific revolution will transform not only our understanding of the physical universe, but also potentially of what it means to be a human being. So, thanks for coming. Particularly glad my parents are coming, to whom the book was dedicated. And enjoy the wine, enjoy the vegan canapes. Thank you for coming.